Hello, everyone. It's another exciting episode of the Ethical AI Discourse Series with my humble self, Wale Ameen. And on this episode, we will be taking a look at AI in the grand scheme of things, the issues of sovereignty, digital value chain, and asking critical questions like who really owns Africa's data. In today's world, as we all know, data is the new gold. Data is the new gold. And especially in the digital economy, it's what really matters. But the big question is for the African continent, who really owns Africa's data? Who profits from it? And how and what is the future for Africa's data? My guest on this episode is a cybersecurity professional. He leads one of the Fortune 500 companies as vice president. I have on set with me Jude Osamor. Hi, Jude. Nice to have you on set.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So I will just make a run for it right now. So, first question. Africa generates lots and lots of data every day. Who is actually capturing the value?
Okay, Africa does generate quite a number of data every day. When it comes to the value or who captures the real data itself, it's heavily latched on governmental agencies in any of all these African countries. They they design the narrative on how this data needs to be controlled or valued, or how data has been used. With that, we're able to help make quite a number of informed economic decisions that can drive the populace to developmental growth, not just for now, but also in the future. So, um, every government of a country, uses data to do quite a number of things. So they definitely will have to be in charge. If you're thinking of how they, maximize their budget, maybe annual budget for the year or for every, tenure that they have an existing government, that helps them with budget allocation, disbursement of funds, provision of amenities, and anything that would make them cater for the growing population, in the nearest future. So in terms of data control and value, really, it's heavily latched on the government.
All right. It's heavily latched on government. Thank you for that. So, what does data sovereignty means in practical terms?
Okay, yeah. From the word sovereignty, has to do with having some level of autonomy or being able to stand alone, to drive the ship on how anything would work, depending on what you're hoping to have sovereignty on. But in the case of data, having the autonomy to be able to navigate how data is being used, data is being stored, data is being shared, data is being maximized, amongst other things, really. So that's what data sovereignty really is at the end of the day. It boils down to how this government who appears to be the one with value for data, you know, have the autonomy of using the data to benefit their respective organizations, governmental parastatals, or ministries, for the betterment of the country.
Would you, as it stands right now, would you say what would be your viewpoint on the place of Africa in the scheme of things when it comes to AI?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Africa in the scheme of things in terms of AI, I think Africa is actually embracing the reality that comes with AI. To be quite honest, Africa has a major role to play, in AI, in artificial intelligence, because one thing about artificial intelligence is the fact that you use information to be able to train, data to now do what you want it to do. Every artificial intelligence technology you find today in the world, it was because we people actually got information to train the data for what it's being used for, and all of that. And Africa has a major role to play. If you're thinking of in the world of science, for example, health, maybe let's say malaria, for example. We realize that statistics has it that malaria has still has a foothold in some maybe underdeveloped African countries. With information like that, it can help the health professionals think of how they can now come up with policies that they could enact, that they can enforce this government of the day to do, to help reduce the spread of such epidemic within their growing population. So not just in the area of health, in the area of computing, in the area of anything that has to do with technology, Africa has a major role to play in spearheading it, in the use of it, in the use of artificial intelligence, in the value of the end product. Because Africa also has a major role to play in that. In terms of the creativity behind artificial intelligence, Africa has a major role to play. Um, I mean, I've seen quite a number of AI related videos, even on social media platforms, that clearly communicate some of the Africa realities. How people live in Africa, that probably people who are in Western community or in other developed countries do not get to see. They probably get to appreciate it more based on how they're able to interact with how AI is being used, or AI has been depicted in Africa in general. So it's not just health. There are quite a number of areas that Africa has a major role to play in terms of artificial intelligence on the long run.
Yeah, valid submission. I like the fact that you said Africa has a vital role to play. Um, on the back of that, do you think Africa is becoming more of a supplier of raw data for foreign AI systems?
Yeah, interestingly, in some to some extent, it can be, it has appeared to look that way because, as somebody who has a very strong research background, I've come to realize that um, if you want to acquire data to do research in the West, for example, it's not very easy because there are policies that are guiding how data is being released for people to use, right? You know, go to the US, go to the UK, and other parts of the world. There are governmental policies that are heavy on some of this data that you probably want to use to research. But if you want to go to Africa, for example, you realize that somehow, you know, they really do not have much policies in place that heavily restrict availability of all this data. And that's why people can just wake up one day, book a flight, go to one forest, I mean, depending on whatever you're trying to do, and get information, go to, a population of people and ask them survey questions. You can't do some of all these things. You can't do it in the West, but however, you probably have to go through the rules. Get approval. They'll vet you. They'll see if it's something that is of the essence. Are there data protection policies? How are you protecting people? People are more educated here. Yeah, just simple information where they can talk about GDPR policies. You're likely to make certain people go into bankruptcy because you're likely to win a war, by your data being used inappropriately, because people know their rights. People can exercise their right. And it's not just knowing, people can stand on their right and win easily. You don't even need a lawyer to go to court. They'll just state and tell you how, all these policies appear to have defied the governmental laws. And, in West like this, the law is the law. The law is easily upheld. Uh, you know, Even if a president can wake up one day and make a one policy, you can't easily just make laws like you own the country, right? There are laws in place that you would need to follow for people to do the needful. And that, if you look at even in terms of the political landscape here, every little thing you see, people are waiting to resign from their jobs because
Mhm.
the law is so strong here. They uphold the law, but in Africa, we can just wake up, go to any place, and get this data. And interestingly, these guys from the West are benefiting from this. They get all this information and use that to have statistics of Africa.
Mhm.
They win
Mhm.
grants. It's as somebody who works in research, I clearly see these things play out. They get round of applause for all these things, but nobody know the kind of stress. Nobody understands how easy it was for them to get this data. They probably didn't go through the challenge of what it is to get data. Anyway, I'm not here to you know put different countries of the world in different perspectives. I'm just trying to tell you how Africa definitely is looking more like a training ground for you know access to data to train whatever needs to be trained in artificial intelligence.
Mm. Training ground. I like what you just mentioned now. That Africa is becoming more like a training ground. We're going to come back to that issue because that's something personally I'm very touchy about, if I dare say so. So, how should African nations, how should we, because again, yeah, we're all Africans, even though we're globally placed, but it's our home. It's still where we call home. How should African nations approach data localization? Um, this is particularly when we look at, from the angle of the fact that where your data is stored is increasingly becoming very important in the grand scheme of things. Whoever houses your data literally controls you because just based off a direction from the top, you could have your provider switch off access, to such. So how do you think, what are the steps, what do you think African nations should do when it comes to data localization? Again, I look at Nigeria just recently, the Central Bank of Nigeria just recently issued out a policy, a data localization policy where it now mandates, fintechs and banks and all what have you to have a process in place, I think for the next 6 months or so, where all of users' data will be stored on local servers, which if you look at it's such a beautiful policy because again, you ask yourself, why should we have our local data saved outside of the continent? So what do you think countries, African governments should do or should be looking at doing, in terms of data localization?
Yeah, irrespective of whatever they are doing in terms of data localization, I think the bone of contention here is how secure is this data, which is the most important thing. Uh, are people safe? Are people secure? Um, why should somebody just be on their phone one day and next thing you hear somebody speaking outside on the phone? How did they get their numbers? What is the level of protection people have? You know, uh, it's just quite unfortunate that it is what it is. It's I'm concerned about data protection in Africa in every sense of it. Um, and that's why African countries need to be very heavy on policies. As much as you probably want to create a lot data hubs, create technologies. Imbibe a certain culture. It's still heavy on what is how protected are people, how secure are this data? Is this data? In such a way that you're not breaking laws, you're not breaching people's confidentiality and all of that. Even within the government, there are a number of things that I find very uh, encroaching. I mean, the other day I saw a CCTV footage of Peter Obi clearly released because somebody who appears to be a minister was trying to score political points with that. But that's clearly a breach of somebody's confidentiality if you were to be in a very developed country. That person's safety is at risk there. That individual's safety is of great concern at that particular point in time, and that can be very that can have legal implications, right? Even on social media, you see people posting people's stories, or you see people who claim to be content creators in the name of pranksters, doing videos of people and posting it without their consent. Like they don't even care if your consent is important. They still post it to make money of it. And these are things that are very, very grievous in developed countries. These are things that you can't walk away from. You don't have the right to do that. I feel there's just a whole lot of governmental orientations that need to be clearly put in place in most of our African countries, especially developing ones, and have their laws upheld. Really, it's one thing to create these laws, it's one thing to create these policies, and it's also another thing to uphold them because upholding them makes it very solid. Makes it very respected. And all of that. So as much as localization is, irrespective of how it needs to be, whatever, irrespective of how companies or countries in Africa want to carry out localization, I think it's important to bear in mind that the protection of data is of utmost priority, irrespective of how you choose to go about it.
Mm. Protection of data is very, very important, very spot on. Do you think African nations are prepared, or do you think we have the resources, the wherewithal to actually go all out on data localization with security being on the topmost, on the front burner, as you have mentioned just now?
Yes, I believe Africa, we have all it takes. We have the technical know-how, we have the skill set, we have the research mindset, people who are very knowledgeable in subject areas. Even we have the technical know-how. There are people who are willing to do the job, who probably don't even have the opportunity. We have people who are willing to make it work. So I think Africa has it, but it's just the discipline to make it work and the willingness to be able to, live by the rules and understand that, there are implications to not making data protection a priority. Because that's how threat actors have their way. Because the essence of cybersecurity is you're protecting data, irrespective of how you're doing it. Because a threat actor is breaking into organizations to steal what? It's stealing data, right? You're hacking into a company. You're launching a different kind of cyber attack because you want to get access to their data. Because that data is something that is precious to them, and you know that if you get access to that data, the company is going to be or the country or the organization is going to be in jeopardy. So at the end of the day, it's just what it is. At the end of the day, Africa has what it takes. We have the right skill set. I've worked with one of the most talented cybersecurity professionals I've had to work with that came all the way from Nigeria. You could see them and these guys have what it takes to support and strengthen the country. But it's just that we need to make these things work at the end of the day for people.
Very true, very true. So my next question will be this: what are the economic implications of losing control of data assets? You just mentioned the issue of security. Now, what are the implications? When we look at that side of things, what are the implications
Yeah,
could arise?
in cybersecurity, there are quite a number of negative implications of cyber attacks. Um, but one of it has to be, I mean, the essence or one of the most prominent has to do with reputational damage, reputational impacts because of the fact that if you build a company for 20 years with everything, strength, money, sweat and blood, you're able to grow your business to a level. One cyber attack has the ability to render all that you've built for years futile. One cyber mistake can turn down the years of reputational strength, and it makes people begin to doubt the credibility of an organization or a country. So These are some of the adverse effect of not doing the needful when it comes to data protection, or putting the right security things in place in organization. Reputational damage, data loss, loss of opportunities, people's safety. Some people can even lose their life in the process, right? Uh, I'll give an instance. For example, maybe you work in a hospital and for some reason, threat actors are able to break into hospital key sensitive information, and with that, they're able to alter tools or technologies that are responsible for people's respiratory activities. If that is altered, whoever is reading the respiratory level of somebody, they're not able to see what goes on the screen anymore, and that can, make people lose their life because. At that point in time, you need to take action, but you're not even taking necessary action out of all that stuff. So these are things that ascertains, these are things that impact, these are things that have negative impact on organizations or countries in Africa in general. Quite a number of them, but one of the very high profile ones has to do with the reputational impact that it has.
All right, reputational
Yeah.
impact. That's so spot on. We're going to move more deeply into this issue of Africa AI in the scheme of things now, and where I want to look at is the place of building competitive AI ecosystems. When we look at the scenario right now, we find out that most of what we have, most of solutions that are being built today, it's from US, you know, um, from Europe, and then from China. The question is, where is Africa in the scheme of things in all of these? So where do you see Africa's place in this? Are we just meant to consume, or do we still stand a chance to build globally acceptable solutions? Where is Africa in the scheme of things right now?
Yeah, I mean, Africa, I think it's more of ideology, right? I think Africa has all it takes. In fact, we are doing really well, especially with the tech ecosystem in Nigeria. I mean, Technician Global Talent Visa, for example, the Nigerian community of tech founders who are on that visa route, the likes of Flutter Waves, the likes of Andela, the likes of what's the name of this company? This, most of all these fintech companies in Nigeria right now that probably doing really well. The pay stacks, these are solutions that were developed by guys, in Nigeria. Most of them are just they all started somehow from a home. Yeah, but at that point in time, they all started thinking of innovative things. A number of them have gotten out of Nigeria. Most of them are somewhere in the UK, somewhere in the US, some are scattered across different part of the world because they were able to think. I bet you, I still think Africa has the best. We are one of the best set of talented human beings on earth. The surface of the earth who can develop solutions, who can create things that can add value. Well, we are somehow we're built to be able to withstand the rigidity of life. To be able to even amidst the challenge, somehow we can create an enabling environment to succeed. We can create an enabling environment to still live, regardless of how we look at things. So yeah, Africa, we have what I do. We can't just we're not just designed to consume. We are actually bound to create. We just probably need the right support. If some of these companies I mentioned are able to still spring out from Nigeria, despite how challenging and difficult the system is, it just goes to tell you how much more the country can achieve. If certain things were put in place, the number of things where we will be able to achieve quite a lot, in the sense of it.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pick off from what you just said now. You just said if certain things are put in place, and that's just going to be my next question. What are those things? What are those policies you think we should be looking at, or the governments of the day should be looking at, to make you know the continent an enabling environment. Like you just said, yes, they're very great, very talented individuals, Nigerians. I mean, we all are. And that's why I for one, particularly feel gutted, just a while ago when I heard CEO of Money Points, he where he made mention that they couldn't find talented individuals, to fill the spots that they had in Money Point. I'm not hitting on that particularly, but I just had to make a reference to that. I feel particularly got it because I know, I mean, many of us do know that there are very talented individuals, who are doing not just well in Nigeria. I mean, we go out, to other places and we're doing things, we're running the shows over there. So the place of talent, I don't think is in question. Rather, I think it's a place of enabling environment, right policies being in place, and just the right environment. So what are the policies? What are the things you feel should be done right? The government of the day needs to do right for us to have, a near perfect creative system that would help, our young ones and our talented individuals.
All right, that's a very, very, good question. Aside from the fact that electricity is important, I think that's even number one. In an ecosystem where people struggle to have basic electricity to do the needful, it kind of demotivates. But right now, I think somehow people are able to survive amidst all that. There's the invention of solar and all that stuff. But I think electricity has a way of giving some level of flexibility for people to be more productive, not just within even the tech ecosystem, but other sectors that are more inclined to adding value to the populace or adding value to the life of the common man, in the long run. So if government or they can ensure that we have stable power, I mean that would help. If they're able to empower as well, create grant opportunities. I remember back then there was this, Tony Elumelu Foundation thing where people had grants, they won grants, they were able to empower entrepreneurs to do stuff. A lot of people metamorphose into other business models uh, over the years with such opportunities. I think it's impressive. That's something that pushes people and motivates people to want to do things. There are a lot of people. There's also the support that has to do with loans as well. I think the criteria to getting loans can be very difficult. Uh, some people find it difficult to succeed with that without having that support system that gives them the kind of loan they need to do whatever business venture they want to do. So maybe creating an enabling environment that would have support financially, not just loan, but could be grants to support businesses to do well and thrive. There are a lot of people who, a number of support will, push them to where they need to go, and a number, and it looks, I mean, there are quite a lot, numerous to mention, to be quite honest, but electricity support from government in terms of finance, support in terms of, uh, you know, grant opportunities, and creating symposiums where like minds can have conversation. Maybe there's a governmental program that is not just governmental program by the leaves, but programs that are very impactful and reflective. Uh, and if government is able to find people who are able to be productive in certain capacity, maybe they want to absorb them into certain arms of the government to do the needful. I'm sure you and I have probably have seen people who are young people, maybe over the news, you see them developing cars, you see them developing aeroplane that are quite, it looks very funny from the outside, but you see them trying it out and it works. That's the level of innovation that we have in the country. Why not absorb talents like that into certain units within the Department of Technology or something,
Mhm.
and allow these people to do their thing? Because some of these very talented young people, the moment other countries find their skill set useful, they have a way of taking them out, and flying them out of the country to better their own economy. So We probably need, not we probably, in Africa we need to have that. We need to have that, system where people can, you know, get into sectors where they can, add value rather than just waiting for nepotistic approach to allow people get jobs into certain sectors.
Mhm. So true, so true, so true. Well said, well said. Um, just getting to the end of the session now. I have just two more questions. Um, how do we innovate? How do we put innovation side by side with sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a good question. Data autonomy, sovereignty is great. Having our autonomy to do our thing. And I think in the midst of having that autonomy to do our thing, as a government in Africa, we can now use whatever we have in terms of data autonomy to now power the next level of problem we want to solve, right? Having access to all the data you have about everybody in the country, the growing population, the age, the socio-economic class of everyone, it now boils down to the government to say, okay, what can I make do of what I have? Okay, looking at, we have very increased population of persons between 20 to 25 among all the total population of individuals in the country. What can we really do? How can we maximize our strength to empower the country as a whole? That would shape the next line of conversation for any government of the day in Africa. Think about, that's how development is born. I was listening to a news the other day about, somebody was saying about how they, raise kids in Norway, or how the government empowers people in Norway. You realize that every kid born at certain ages get introduced to certain sports. They give you the opportunity to do certain sports, and whatever sport you show more strength in, they help you focus on that sport so that you can become a star in that area. That's clearly a governmental based project because they probably had a data that they were able to use to make informed decisions. So Africa can also work in that model. You have quite a number of data. Every day you're always doing NIN, every day you're always doing voters registration. All these are people's information. What apart from voter statistics, what else can you do with that data? With all the ministries and parastatals that are in existence, how can you allocate funds, into those areas? How many local governments do we have, in the country, for example? How can you make sure that every funds that are being disbursed to the state go straight to the local government? Because these are the guys that are more, the local government are the ones who really touch the common man. All right.
Mhm.
If I were to be president, for example, I mean, these are the things I would, by my first day in office, I would have meeting with all the local governments in all the 30 states, all local government chairmen, not even governors. Because, I mean, governors will always be governors, right? Because local governments chairmen are like the presidents in the locality
Yeah,
that are the common man.
yeah.
Because Nigeria, as big as Nigeria is, for example, it no matter how you continue to disburse fund as a government, there's certain people that you will not get to. Not because the people in the seat of power are bad, but because of the fact that sadly there's a system where, you know whatever funds is being allocated for project doesn't get to the end user before, like you realize that it would probably reduce before it gets to the final bus stop. So why not
Mhm.
end that, bypass that, speak to the local government chairman directly and make them accountable to what they need to do to reach the common man. All this is like a case of having access to data and using it to make informed decisions. So that's how we can go hand in hand, having the autonomy of data and now using it to make informed decision to develop your country.
Yeah, well said, well said. So lastly, we will just be wrapping up now. Um, what do you think digital self-determination for Africa looks like, say, in the next decade? It's trying to chart a path for Africa right now.
Yeah, Africa. I would say Africa would spearhead the the area of creativity in that space. I foresee an opportunity of a lifetime where, with the advent of artificial intelligence, Africa will be able to champion some of the things that other parts of the world would come to Africa to take advantage from or leverage from to develop what they have. Um, I still think it's a gold mine at this point. It's still an untapped resources. People are still trying to understand what it's all about. People are yet to understand the weight and gravity of what they can make use of it with. But then it's because it's still relatively new and in this space, so people are just trying to first get acquainted with it. But with time, it will get to a point where Africa will start running with that race beyond what we currently know, even beyond the people who probably even started it to begin with, because of the creativity mindset we've always had and the excellent spirit Africa, ideally does have.
Yeah, thank you so much. The excellent spirit. I love that final note.
Yeah,
It's something I'm personally also passionate about. The fact that I know that we have an abundance of talent in Africa, and like we've just mentioned, like you've mentioned, it's just about having the right structure in place, having the right environment. You just mentioned electricity now, which very interestingly, it's something that is very germane. I mean, no country moves forward innovatively without basic amenities in place. You look at everywhere around the world. It's simply because these guys have the basic things already sorted out and they don't have to worry about it. And
yeah,
so which leaves that mindset that plays in their mind to be able to now concentrate on futuristic things as against having to struggle with the very basic necessities of life. And I think it's just you've said it all well. That is what Africa needs, and hopefully we are going to see an Africa that is proactive, an Africa, that is progressive, an Africa that, champions new ideas so that we are not just, tagging along, as it were,
yeah.
but we innovate, we bring up new ideas, and the world borrows a leaf from us. That is where we should be going. That is where we should, be at. Thank you so much, Jude Osamor. It's been a nice time discussing with you. I particularly learned myself. It's been a reawakening. Thank you so much for your words. I'll catch you on another
Pleasure.
episode. So, guys, that's it on this episode of Ethical AI Discourse Series. I believe this has been enlightening. Um, you can please subscribe to the channel and share the videos and just let the conversation continue. Thank you. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.